Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your attendance. This is the Meet the Author presented by the WTO Bookshop and the WTO Library. This afternoon, we're pleased to present Stefano Inama, who will be discussing the second edition of his book, Rules of Origin in International Trade. He is the chief trade lawyer for the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development and a leading expert on rules of origin. Joining him on the podium are our two discussants, Pierre Sauvé, a senior trade specialist with the World Bank Group's Macroeconomics, Trade and Investment Global Practice, and Darlene Marty, a trade policy specialist in the Market Access Division at the World Trade Organization and secretary to the Committee on Rules of Origin. For those unfamiliar with the structure of this session, it takes place in three parts, with an introduction by the author, commentary from the discussants, and finally an opportunity for the audience to pose their questions. So, with that, pass it to you, Stefano.
However, the built-in agenda in this agreement on having an harmonized set of non-preferential rules of origin, after 15 years of negotiation, the WTO members were unable to achieve a consensus. And as a result of this, we do not have a multilateral agreement on rules of origin which is governing non-preferential rules of origin. Basically, rules of origin, they continue to live in a kind of no man's land. And we have been witnessing in recent years the growing number of free trade areas. Now, each time that there is a free trade area, it requires a set of rules of origin. As FTAs are multiplying, so the rules of origin are also multiplying. And this compliance with this different set of rules of origin implies a cost for firm and to international trade. It also greatly confusing governments and firms on how to make use of this free trade area agreement. So this is a complexity on rules of origin. Complexity also generated by the fact that there is no multilateral role, and many they are tried. GATT, WTO, WCO, they all tried, to have a multilateral discipline of rules of origin, but this has proved impossible to date. So this complexity makes it a trendy topic, but also a difficult one. A Canadian finance minister after NAFTA has been famous, saying, rules of origin are very, very complex. You don't want to know about them. These are terrible things to work with. Now, probably he didn't know that, or he didn't reach out to the Trump administration when they were renegotiating the rules of origin in the US, Mexico, and Canada agreement, but they are even more complex than those under NAFTA. But such is the way of life in rules of origin, and myself as an international civil servant and advisor and expert on rules of origin, I'm facing continuing questions about what are the best rules of origin, why the rules of origin are so important, what is the best methodology to draft rules of origin, change of tariff classification, ad valorem percentage, working on processing, because the world of rules of origin is also plenty of acronyms, which makes life even more difficult than what it is. So the reply that I have to provide is not entirely satisfactory, in the sense that there is not such a thing, a magic solution to the complexity of rules of origin. The solution has to be tailored like a suit. You know, in the sense, I mean, to every problem, to every free trade agreement, there are existing best practices, but at the end of the game, the rules of origin need to be tailored to the trade instrument that are supposed to govern. And therefore, I mean, there is, hence, I mean, the complexity of the topic. Now, when it comes to the reason why I wrote this book, well, I wrote this book because I think it provides some tools, some answers to the questions that have been posed and will be increasingly posed since, I mean, there is no multilateral agreement on side on rules of origin. Now, all this, you know, maybe does not provide a satisfactory answer why you wrote that thick book of 1,200 pages on rules of origin. Well, I mean, you know, and then I was wondering to myself, and I said the most convincing argument has been, you know, two main reasons. One comes from suffering, and one comes from a desire. Now, the suffering, I mean, when I'm an international civil servant, so I'm working providing advising to countries and firms. This means that I had to sit for days, sometimes, in negotiating rooms, hearing the different delegations. And sometimes I must confess to you that the negotiations are going towards a dead end, or the negotiations that don't make any sense. So I wondered to myself, wow, you know, while I'm spending my days of my life is in negotiating rooms, why I'm doing this, you know, why, you know, what I've done wrong in my life, you know, I mean, to deserve all this. And you know, that's, I mean, the book, I mean, is coming out and trying to assist those that are in negotiations, you know, to deal, well, you know, next time, read the book, and maybe we can find a better solution and spend less days in the negotiating room. Because the point is that during this negotiation, you hear many things, but sometimes they are contradict the essence and spirit of free trade. I cannot say all the situation because clearly there is a confidentiality, I need to be diplomatic, and I cannot reveal, you know, certain situation which may be embarrassing. But I can quote some, you know, some of these situations during an FTA negotiations. One delegate took the floor and they say that a free trade area, free trade on this agreement for coffee and coffee products, only for the coffee that has been grown and harvested in the region. And this basically forgets the fact that mixing coffee and roasting coffee is the most important economic activity. So if you restrict trade to coffee that is grown and harvested in the region, you deprive of curtail the possibility to older businessmen to mix coffee of the region with other kind of coffee, or to confer to the roasting process originating status and being part of a free trade area agreement. Now, there are other examples, like in some regions, I asked to a secretariat, why you keep insisting on these rules of origin? It has created problems for you and for your firms for the last 20 years. You know, why you keep insisting, I mean, and reassessing, restating that rules of origin is the best? And the answer that was coming was, well, that's our way. I say our way, but okay, but the law of gravity also applies in your region, like in all the earth. If you apply a bad rules of origin, it will not create trade on your region. And these are one of, or I can quote another one, in certain regions they really emphasize the request for high value added, 40% or 60% of value added to be traded in a free trade area. But many they do not consider that in that area they may not producing intermediate products to assemble the finished product. They forget the example of iPhone, which is manufactured in China, but is manufactured, but in reality is assembled from intermediate products that are coming from other regions, and the value added is 10%. But I would say that no one is arguing that China is not part of the value chains. So be part of the value chains and have rules of origin that allow you to be part of the value chains. I mean, should be the guiding principle rather than creating industry or value added by having stringent rules of origin. That's the message that I've been sending to policymakers and negotiators and firms during various decades. But I must say, I mean, that at times, most you provide evidence, most you see the negotiation going towards a dead end or towards the opposite direction. Because there are policymakers that believe that strong rules of origin or stringent rules of origin can incentivate, can provide incentive for regional trade, while in reality, most of the time they only are creating trade diversion. Now, the private sector and the firms, they are also source of pain, but also source of satisfaction. I would like to say, I mean, that the role of firms and the private sector is often the key to success. Because at the end, I mean, it's the private sector and the firms that are using free trade area agreements. So they possess the real information, what is needed for them to comply with rules of origin. However, the fact is that firms sometimes are ambivalent in the sense that the firms are there to make profit. They don't realize at times that you need to spend some time on rules of origin, explaining to your government, to your custom officer, to your negotiators what you really want. And sometimes this does not happen. Sometimes this does not happen because the government does not consult the private sector, or sometimes because the private sector is not ready to provide the right information or does not have the time to provide that kind of information to the negotiators. So here is the suffering part that motivated, I mean, the drafting of this book. But there is also the positive side, the rosy note. The rosy note is that explain the reason of these 1,000 and more pages on rules of origin. The confession is that I simply hope that in these pages I'm providing the tools and the answers to many questions that have been posed about rules of origin. Most of all, I hope to be providing the tools to help negotiators, firms, and academia to deal with rules of origin. My desire and dream, if I have really to make a true confession, is the next time I enter into a negotiating room or I provide advice, I don't hear anymore the usual stereotypes about rules of origin. I mean, I need to improve, you know, and in order to improve myself, I also need that the level of negotiation and discussion on rules of origin are also improving. So I'm a bit selfish on this respect, but I think, I mean, that with this book, I'm contributed, I mean, to address some of the questions that are been around the rules of origin for quite some decades. Let me briefly share the content of these 1,200 pages, you know, I mean, in a nutshell. You know, chapter 1 deals with the multilateral efforts. As I said, there is no multilateral agreement. There is a multilateral agreement on rules of origin, but the built-in agenda, fortunately, has not been concluded. Then, what is left? The GATT tried in 1947. It didn't get to a solution. WCO, we have a Kyoto Convention on 1977 and 2000, but they don't provide a comprehensive discipline on rules of origin. And most recently, I discussed the work that has been undertaken in the Committee on Rules of Origin on preferential rules of origin for LDCs, which has contributed to revive the work on rules of origin at multilateral level. In chapter 2, I focus on the work that has been carried out in WCO and in WTO on non-preferential rules of origin. This work has been carried out almost 15 years ago, not 20 years ago, but I must say that this work is not history. This is where I become an expert on rules of origin. At that time, that was the pinnacle of experts of rules of origin around the world that they met for years to negotiate rules of origin. I learned my job there. And the job there that has been done there, you find it, I mean, nowadays, most of the time reflected in free trade area negotiations. So that's chapter, I mean, some kind of history there, is also the learning ground for appreciate the technicalities of rules of origin. In chapter 3, I discuss the unilateral rules of origin under GSP schemes and AGOA, duty-free, and also the evolution of the two models of rules of origin. Main models of rules of origin are the US, which are moved, which has been established with NAFTA, and the series of free trade area that the US has negotiated, and most recently on the US, Mexico, and Canada free trade area on one end, and on the other end, I discuss the model provided by the European Union and the recent FTAs that the European Union has entered with a series of African countries, but most recently Asian countries. In chapter 4, I discuss the economics of rules of origin.
How many chapters are there?
No, seven. So I'm there. No, I need to explain it to them. Otherwise, I need to explain it to them. Chapter 4 is the economics. So in the economics, where I have a law background, and so I discuss with my friends economists, and sometimes I provide that the economists, they mostly do regressions, and they also drawing kind of simulations. My advice, to the economists sometimes is also good to read the rules. Because the rules, if I read the rules, then at the end, the conclusion, they are more robust. And I think there are discussing also the fact that utilization rate of the free trade area agreement, but also unilateral trade preferences, are a precious tool to better understand what is a good and bad rules of origin. In chapter 6, and I'm there, almost to chapter 7, I discuss, there is includes the most important novelty of the book, which is how to draft the product-specific rules of origin. And what I write there, is come from my experiencing in the different regions, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In our negotiation we're undergoing on drafting product-specific rules of origin, that are those appendixes that are sometimes 100 pages long, that you find in every free trade area agreement. And there at the end, I also discuss a methodology that I drafted on how product-specific rules of origin can be drafted using an input-output matrix. On chapter 7, I discuss administration rules of origin, because certificate of origin, all the paperwork related to origin, which is a kind of passport, of trading goods, they are different from country to countries. And that's, this panoply of rules of origin certification is another cost to firms. Finally, I thank you all for being here today, and I also would like to thank those that created at times some despair and desperation in myself, because they have also provided at the same time the motivation to write this book. And I wish to thank them all, even if they are not in this room today. Thank you very much.
Me?
I guess so.
This is, well, I'm very pleased, Stefano, that you've invited me to reveal in public the enormity of my ignorance of the subject matter I'm about to speak about. Why am I doing this? I turned 63 last Saturday. I'm close to retirement. I should know better. You
miss something.
I spent my whole career, practicing Ricardian economics. Specialization, stay to your topic, Don't roam too broadly. Here I am talking about rules of origin, something I really have never even come close to in my career. But anyway, it's a day to celebrate. I've published enough books to know the feeling when that monkey is finally off your back. Hopefully forever, but in your case, until the 3rd edition. And so when Stefano asked me, Pierre, would you care to be a discussant at my book launch? We're friends, we've been friends for decades. How could I say no? But I had no idea what I was getting into. And I realized what I was getting into on Monday when I arrived in Geneva and saw this monstrosity of a book on my desk 1,279 pages. Just to give you some context, that is 79 pages more than Tolstoy's War and Peace. I mean, you know, we live in a world of increasing attention deficit disorders, and trade negotiators are not immune from this disease. It takes a brave soul to write something that is 1,279 pages long. Kudos to you, my friend. Now, you know you're in trouble as a discussant when the table of contents of a book is 30 pages long. And I said, oh my God, what am I going to do? And the book landed on my desk on Monday. I've been spending the whole week in the public forum sort of embarrassing myself in different sessions. So of course I haven't read it. So, you know, what can I say about a book I haven't read? Probably not much. But I've been a trade negotiator. I've been around rules of origin negotiations from a distance, from a safe distance. I had the privilege of being in the Canadian negotiating team of NAFTA 1.0, which you described earlier. And I was close enough, and on days, you know, talking to my rules of origin colleagues, to realize that, you know, wow, I'm glad I'm not involved in those negotiations. This is so unbelievably boring, no, complex, and challenging. But you also realize that, you know, the multiple uses to which rules of origins can be put, not all of them of equal economic merit. They are very crafty instruments, potentially of very deep protection. NAFTA was no exception to that rule. I also know from having interacted with them that rules of origin negotiators are precious instruments. We need these people. We need their expertise. It is so unique. It is so deep. But on most days, they're probably not people I want to have dinner with. Maybe lunch from time to time. I mean, they're strange people. Rules of origin, I mean, you got to be strange to you know, to do that. Read the book, you'll see. But I will say, are there any rules of origin experts here? Okay, my apologies. These are, of course, jokes. Am I being filmed? So you are witnessing the end of my career. Early retirement has come. But I was going to say, you know, rules of origin experts are a bit peculiar, and you have to be. But Stefano is really an exception. I mean, he is the funkiest rule of origin guy I've ever met. You know, he has love of fast cars, of fancy suits, of cowboy boots, joie de vivre, joie de rire, you know? The Italian magic. So, you know, I do an exception for you, no doubt. No doubt. So what can I say? You know, I'm 5 minutes into my comment and I haven't said a word about the book yet. Not surprising, I haven't read it. I was wondering, what use could I make of this book? You were kind enough to give it to me. It would make a fantastic doorstopper, you know? There's not a door that can resist this book. It could probably even take a bullet, you know? But in Geneva, that's, you know, I don't need that. This is, you know, placid city, no problem. So, of course, my first thing, Stefano, is to congratulate you on producing, really, wow, a magnum opus that really addresses every conceivable angle of what is, in my view, the most technically challenging area of trade governance. And you've done that, which I find even more impressive, although a bit, I have questions. You did that while you were fully employed. Did you devote any time to UNCTAD activities these past few years? I mean, how does one produce, you know, so much having a full-time job? I mean, your evenings must have been very busy. What I like about the book, really, which I haven't read, but the blurb at the back is well written, but I have glanced at it, is the multidisciplinary lens that you bring to it. And it's very rare that especially lawyers, why do you become a lawyer? Are there any lawyers in this room? Most people become lawyers because in high school they're not so good at math, no? So, and when you're not good at math, there's not much left to choose from. You certainly can't do economics. But this is a book that is full of pretty sophisticated economics, and that is, for a lawyer to write that kind of a book, but also not only a lot of sophisticated economics, but, and this is again a reflection of who Stefano is, very deep political economy insights that really tell you the story behind the story. You read between the lines. Because he has so much experience on the ground advising governments, and because he has been so often in the trenches of designing rules of origin. So I think that unique aspect, that multidisciplinary, deeply operational aspect of the book really commends itself. So congratulations. I have one concern with the book cover. I don't know what you were smoking when you chose it, but it's powerful tobacco. I can't understand what relation it has to rules of origin, but I'm sure you're going to explain in the Q&A session. Now, just a few questions, and I direct the questions to you and also to my fellow panelists, because you are real experts. Just a couple of questions that came to mind on rules of origin more broadly as I held the book in my hands. One is, and it relates partly to what you just said in your opening presentation, why has it proven, and why is it still proving so difficult to advance negotiations on rules of origin in this building, on non-preferential rules of origin? What's the political economy of that roadblock? As an ignoramus, I would like to know why we're not able to make progress in this institution. My second question is whether you as experts and also in the audience are concerned by the increasing use of rules of origin to achieve non-trade objectives, or trade objectives of very dubious merit. And I think here of NAFTA 2.0, where rules of origin in the automobile sector are assigned very intricate trade, investment, labor standard, wage level norms. I mean, how far can this go? And do you think that the example of USMCA is actually going to be replicated on a larger scale? And if so, with what kind of systemic impacts? My third question will reveal how naive I am, and would be to say, should the WTO, unable to even agree on non-preferential rules, should WTO disciplines on preferential rules mandate, equal rules of origin across all sectors, non-sector specific rules of origin, with a view to reducing the scope for product-specific and industry-specific capture? Clearly, I'm daydreaming in suggesting that, but has that idea ever even been advanced by countries that perhaps take a more enlightened economic approach to rulemaking? Fourth question, you're not taking notes.
It's on my brain.
Fourth question is, do you see some of the meta trends in trade, the reconfiguration of GVCs, the push towards nearshoring and friendshoring, affecting the conversation on rules of origin? If I'm importing no longer from a country that I fear, but from a country that is a friend, whose legal regime and political regime I have greater comfort towards, will that result in perhaps more relaxed rules of origin or not? The answer from USMCA seems to be not, because Mexico is a friendly country to the US, but still. Anyway, I asked the question. And the second meta trend that I think is interesting is climate change. Do you see the carbon content of products being increasingly woven into rule of origin design? I would assume that that will at some point become an issue we need to think about and is likely to be contentious. And then my final question is it your intention to make this book even bigger when it's the third edition by tackling two things that I found missing Rules of origins for services and investment. They exist. They exist. I have written on it. I think the only paper ever devoted to that topic. That's not true, because one of my students from Bern read that paper and wrote a PhD on it, on rules of origin in services. So that's interesting. At Bocconi, absolutely. Okay, my final observation, this has been too long, is I was curious reading the book whether it was co-sponsored, but I didn't see. It's Cambridge University Press, but I thought it might have been co-sponsored by the Société Suisse d'Ophtalmologie. It's written in such small font, by the time you read it, you need a changed prescription. So my advice for volume 3, for third edition, make it a 2-volume set. You'll make more money from 2 volumes and have a bigger font. So Stefano, congrats for producing an amazing book, which I'm looking forward to read at some point in the future. I can't wait to see the film version on a giant screen. Maybe you've already made a deal with Netflix, so on any mobile device. And I would suggest that you ask George Clooney to play yourself.
Well, what else can I say about the book after this? And I think it's a great lead, because I think, in fact, I'd like to start from where you finished, and the fact that rules of origin is an ever-evolving field. And this is what I find amazing about this, that it's such an old instrument. It's been out there, I don't know, for ages. And some of the first problems about rules of origin, or with rules of origin, were reported already in the 40s, which motivated the drafters of the GATT to already include Article 9 about marks, and already recognize there the costs that rules of origin create for businesses. And this was complicated by then. But now, this took a whole other dimension, because of the number of agreements, of course, out there with different sets of rules of origin, and therefore potentially the fact that companies have to deal and manipulate on a weekly basis multiple sets of rules of origin. But then it also got more complicated with a multiplication of national governments that adopted non-preferential rules of origin. To this date, we have about 50 or 60 WTO members with non-preferential rules of origin. And it's not a surprise that those are the heaviest trading nations. But all of that sounds old already, because when we bring in the new dimension, of course, of fragmentation of production and globalization, and the difficulties that this brings in determining and identifying a single country of origin for goods. And that also is old news, because as you said, we now are into nearshoring, friendshoring, and asking rules of origin to inform better consumers about traceability of products, and not only the final product, but the ingredients, the way it was produced. We are asking rules of origin to help inform consumers about the labor conditions with which the products were consumed and where produced and where they were produced. We are asking rules of origin now to inform customs and administrations about the carbon content of the ingredients and parts that were used in the products. So I have no doubt that Stefano will have a lot of fun initiating, as of Monday next week, his 3rd edition of the book, because this is a never-ending story. It's a never-ending story, and this is really what I find so fascinating about the area of rules of origin. Is it's a very technical area, a very complex area, a very legalistic area, and yet one that connects to economics, to trade, to labor, to environment, to integration or deep integration, as we were speaking as well before. So all of this really means that I think I can only join you in congratulating Stefano for trying to put together the basics, really, of all of this in a single publication. And I think Stefano's book is nothing short of a reference point really in this area. I think it's a manual and a guidebook for anyone who has a little bit of interest in this area but doesn't know much. You can use the 30-page table of content to find the areas that you have an interest in. And if you want to know more about the technicalities, you can delve deeper. A few words also about the content, and I think the book is not useful only for people who work on rules of origin, but it is really also, I think, a depository of the history of rules of origin in the past 20 or 30 years. And as Stefano was mentioning before, members have launched negotiations at the WTO to harmonize non-preferential rules of origin and to adopt rules of origin that would be used to manage a number of trade instruments. Members have lost interest in these negotiations now, and I think it's not a coincidence that they have done so. If you think of it, rules of origin are only used in two types of circumstances. When they're needed to give better treatment to goods because of preferential trade agreements, reciprocal or non-reciprocal, or when they're needed in order to implement restrictive measures, so, and therefore give less favorable treatment to goods of certain origins, be it anti-dumping, be it safeguard measures, be it countervailing duties or countervailing measures. And with the return of more political considerations into trade, or with the, I don't know whether speaking about return is correct. Maybe it's always been there, but with the arrival of blunt political policy making and trade making, rules of origin, of course, carry the risk of being more instrumentalized than they have been in the past. And you've mentioned the revision of NAFTA rules of origin. And I think there's a number of other elements and a number of other worrying elements that we could also mention. And with all of this, what I find quite interesting is we have governments turning away from political cooperation in this area, possibly because they are happy keeping more autonomy in this area. And yet, we have a growing business demand for more clarity and for more simplification in this area. I think this crystallizes, of course, in the trade facilitation agreement, but there's also a very specific agenda that could apply to rules of origin as well. And in that context, I think Stefano's book is also a good entry point. And perhaps for the third edition, what we will have is an 8th chapter there speaking about a business agenda in this area, because I'm really amazed to see that businesses have to comply and have to bear the costs of complex, diverse rules of origin, and yet we don't have a stronger business agenda in this area. So having said all that, I think, as I said, those who want an introduction to the topic will find out this to be your ideal guidebook. And those that already know about the topic but want to learn more about the specifics, be it administrative requirements, be it how to draft the rules, be it what is the best possible way to calculate value and how do you go about it, all of that is in the book as well. So it also makes a very good reference point to those that have experience in the topic as well. So congratulations, Stefano, for I wouldn't use the word monstrosity of book, but for an enormous, really, effort in trying to centralize all that information, which currently is completely scattered in a single publication. So yes, congratulations.
So at this juncture, we would open for audience questions. I don't know who wants, excellent.
Thank you very much. I have not read this book, but I read the first edition, and I wanted to know whether I will find in this edition answers that I couldn't find in the first edition. The issue which I have in mind is what was mentioned. It is a question of carbon content. I'm working currently on CBAM, and obviously the issue comes that CBAM is being applied to the products which represent carbon emissions done in a production processes and methods before. So it is assessment of the carbon content somewhere. If countries which apply CBAM would have a, will not make a kind of loophole or a specific arrangement with other countries, then there is no problem. But if, for example, we will have a CBAM will not be applied to countries of a similar ambition, the question is if those countries of similar ambitions have got a way how to prove the products that are being exported from these countries to, for example, European Union, do not contain foreign, somewhere else carbon content. Regular rules of origin will not provide that because you could have a small fraction of the most carbon-intensive fraction could represent very small value. However, so it's a question whether this I can find here or not, maybe in a third edition. And the second issue that which struck me quite strongly, it's when you've got sanctions towards a country which by chance exports oil. I don't know, you could imagine which countries I could have in mind. And suddenly you realize that there is still export of oil and reaching other countries, which is done sometimes via mixing this oil with other oil in such an extent, after several mixing, you've got 95% of the oil coming from this country. So it's a question whether in sanctions or in bans of this, you could also have this type of rules of origin application, and whether you explain in this book how it works, if not, maybe in third edition. And thank you very much for it, because I found it very useful to find the answers for many other questions that I had when reading your first edition. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I'm Buddhi Upadhyay from Permanent Mission of Nepal in Geneva. First of all, I would like to congratulate Stefano for this great work. You completed successfully the second edition, which is definitely very useful as you highlighted. I would just like to request, as the book is very big, and how we LDCs or the business people of least developed country members could benefit from your book. But like some specific areas may be there, like LDC specific chapters or LDC specific certain provisions, definitely, because the rules of origin is very important for LDCs. So could you please briefly share that how LDCs or business people or exporters of LDCs could easily benefit from that? Thank you.
Do you want to respond first, or do you want to take more questions first? Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Next. So I think the first question, I expected, the question about carbon dioxide, and I think somebody is already in some offices somewhere is already thinking about how to craft or how to draft something which could be, related to rules of origin. The issue with rules of origin at present now is that they look only to one dimension, which is the dimension of manufacturing. Manufacturing, for instance, there is the famous example of a Nike shoes. A Nike shoes, the manufacturing part of a Nike shoes is $12, and the shoes comes to the consumer at $100. All the other costs are related to services, but services are not counted when you do, an origin calculation. At present, carbon dioxide content in rules of origin are not there yet. But maybe in the third edition, I would love to. I would love to deal with this problem, you know, because probably there could be, like, there is potentiality to use rules of origin, but they are an evolving subject, as Darlan has just said, to touch upon the intangible, the services area. But we are not there yet, but we're getting close. There's been USMCA. They already crossed the boundary to work, to labor, to the cost of labor, which till recently was unprecedented. But I mean, they crossed the border from manufacturing to services. Has been one effort by the European Union in which they also introduced an element of services in rules of origin for if they were employing in the manufacturing of textile garments work of Syrian refugees. And that would have been counting as value added. So there are some little precedent there and there, which is, I see from the faces are quite technical. I think, I mean, there will be some evolutions, I mean, towards that direction, but you will have to wait, I mean, the third edition. One of the big challenges that was in writing this, I mean, is to keep it as updated as possible. And one of the big challenges I'm not hiding was being USMCA, the new replacement of NAFTA. They came out, I mean, 2020, and then in 2021 there was the uniform rules of application, which is another, rules of origin in USMCA are already about 200 pages. And then on top of that, there is a uniform on how to apply the rules of origin, which is a common trilateral guide between the three countries, which is another 150 pages, which is very useful, but costed me a lot of work, I mean, to maintain the book as updated as possible. Related to the issue of LDCs, well, there is a lot of LDCs in the book. You know, there is especially on the recent work what we have been doing, and we will be continuing to be doing in the Committee on Rules of Origin with Darlan. The question on how disseminate the content of rules of origin for LDCs and also the content of the book. Actually, I mean, would be very glad, I mean, to the donors if they buy my book and will disseminate to all LDCs. You know, but I mean, I don't see it, you know, but we as UNCTAD, I mean, we have published a number of handbooks, a number of publications that are free of charge and that can be distributed, and we are also carrying out workshops. Of course, much will also depends on the donor, on the funding activities for capacity building for LDCs and other countries, so that capitals and firms in LDCs they can be equipped in negotiating and understanding and comply with rules of origin. This is something that donors are reluctant to do, or maybe they do it for one. So the EU does for the EU, US does for the US. I mean, it would be better to use an international organization because we can touch upon all the schemes and all the rules at once, rather than doing one activity, I mean, per country. I stop here. I think I will come to your question as well.
Yeah, look, I like somebody who asked a previous question. I also have the 2009 edition, which I don't remember why I bought it, but it's been gathering dust on my bookshelf for almost 10 years now, and I just wanted to know how much you're charging for the second edition. No, I mean, the WTO bookshop, usually when you launch a book, I think you do a special price, like you do like some sort of discount. So I'm kind of wondering if the bookshop is doing a special price for the launch. And just in response to the gentleman from Nepal, is he still here? Yeah, so you can actually, you can get the book on Library Genesis, both the 2009 and 2022 edition. I just checked, so that's free. But of course it's in violation of copyright, so I can't encourage people to do that. And I would, of course, never do that. I'd pay because Stefano's a friend. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to give a compliment and a congratulations to Mr. Stefano, as he has been our advisor in the group of least developed countries. We appreciate that you have brought this book, compiling all important information that which will be pinnacle to our work in the WTO, and mostly importantly that you have brought in light some of the aspects of least developed countries, and we looking forward actually on how our partners who are providing the preferential markets that they reform their rules of origin as per the least developed countries request, which you have, which is in the decision, a ministerial decision of Nairobi. And I think that in going forward, we want also to see in the Committee of Rules of Origin that discussions are advancing as a part of the enhancing the transparency, basically, because they affect our private sector in complying with the complex rules of origin and somehow very diverse from member to member. So once again, Stefan, congratulations for the job done. Thank you very much.
Where are you from, sir?
Tanzania.
Hello. I'm sorry, maybe I didn't catch what you said before because it was very loud. Maybe you have already answered my question. We know that there are two types of rules, non-preferential and preferential rules of origin. I have learned that it's very important to differentiate because we have two different types and we have two different, some kind of purposes and two different consequences. As the colleague of WTO already said, non-preferential rules of origin, they are very important to know about them with regard to tariff defense instruments or measures, and preferential rules of origin with regard to preferential consequences as duty-free imports, etc. My question is, how deep did you address this topic in your book? Or did you address this topic and how deeply? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elia, for sharing with us the experiences that we have been living together. I mean, in the Committee on Rules of Origin for first, the negotiation of the decision on preferential rules of origin on Nairobi decision 2015, and afterwards we are now living the saga of implementation of the decision, which is still evolving. The next 13 October we have another episode in WTO where we'll be discussing how the Nairobi decision on rules of origin, preferential rules of origin for LDCs is going to be implemented. That's is a work, I mean, that which is led by LDCs, and it has revived the work on rules of origin in WTO. Coming back to your question, Pierre, you know, there has been a kind of episode, 15 years of negotiation, and basically on 2008 it was clear, I mean, that there was not any more negotiations on the harmonized set on preferential rules of origin. So the world at the time missed a golden opportunity. Why? I mean, that's another big question. There are some notorious member states that were no longer interested at that stage to having a consensus on that.
Just tell us the capital, the name of the capital, maybe not the capital.
Guess around Capitol Hill, you know. At that time, they lost it. I mean, I think, you know, there is a lot of history, also personalities. You know, when you're talking about negotiation, there is a lot of personalities. I mean, there are both, I mean, they struck the deal. I think at some point, I mean, there was a consensus, and the consensus did not get there because of a personality issues, I believe. Because, I mean, we were very close to that. I mean, the work, I mean, was done. We was almost concluded, but for we missed the train for 1 minute, And then after that persons, that were possibly having the consensus, they left the administration, other person came in, and you lost the opportunity. Of course, there was also a stance, by some WTO members, that of interface between non-preferential rules of origin and the use of trade remedies, basically anti-dumping. That was one of the main stumbling block, which I deal in the book. And I think the other question about non-preferential and preferential, I think in the book, there are dedicated chapters to both of the arguments. To both set of non-preferential and preferential rules of origin. One issue that I found evolving as well is that there has been some convergence between the two. In the sense, the scope of non-preferential and preferential rules of origin are clearly different. They're cast in stone, they're cast in law. When you go into the technicalities of the rules of origin, when you go into the product-specific rules of origin, in certain cases there has been a convergence towards having more liberal product-specific rules of origin in certain sectors, which were less sensitive. Why? Because in certain sectors there is MFN-free. So in these sectors, there is the scope for divergence between non-preferential and preferential rules of origin is reduced because there is no margin of preference. And these, are the sectors that could be chemicals, for instance, where also the private sector marked an unprecedented advancement and progress, because basically the chemical industries, they found an agreement among themselves, coming from TTIP, at the time of transatlantic negotiation between EU and the US. The private sector of two parties, they get together and they negotiated the rules of origin, and they come out with a set of negotiations. So business was faster than trade negotiators in finding a solution to the issue of rules of origin. So the big divide that was present, 20, 30 years ago between non-preferential and preferential rules of origin in terms of product-specific requirement is narrowing in some sector, in others not. Textile, clothing, steel, forget. In these sectors, there is a wide divide. The rules of origin are not convergent, and I don't see it in the foreseeable future any kind of hope, to building convergence on this sector. But for other sectors, and that's what I'm also arguing in the book, in sense that there is hope, for progress at multilateral level towards disciplining rules of origin by a plurilateral agreement, which can be carried out in WTO or can be carried out in WCO or the two together. There is an opportunity of a revised Kyoto Convention, NSK, which is now negotiating in these days in the World Customs Organization. So there is, we missed the opportunity 20 years ago. Maybe there is an opportunity now, but of course there is also the climate that you just mentioned. And then I think, the rules of origin will also be used, towards, there is already a kind of, the world is already divided in models. Some are following the EU model, some are following, the US model, which are inspiring, which are creating friends, less friends. There is a variation for that. Probably in the future we will see, these kind of models evolving, towards even more, including product-specific rules of origin, which may take into account certain peculiarities that are emerging from the new world, of conflict or political divide that we can see in these days. I think there are more questions. Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Sergio Martinez. I'm an economist here at the WTO. Previously, I was a colleague at the ALDC division at UNCTAD. So my question is on the drafting of the rules of origin, ensuring consistency between regional trade agreements. So an example of this that has come from the business perspective is then when you have a given country and businesses have to comply with multiple rules of origin provided by several regional trade agreements, always that creates complexity for different businesses, especially for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. So I was wondering if the book provides any insights on what are the considerations policymakers need to take into account for drafting rules of origin in a way that reduces this complexity that businesses, especially small businesses, can encounter when dealing with this? Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Sarah Ashur and I come from Egypt. I'm from the Ministry of Trade and Industry and I've been working within the negotiation of rules of origin within several agreements. First, I would like to thank Stefano because he's been of great help in several agreements, especially the AFCFTA and the perspective he has been providing to the member states. It's always very difficult to simplify rules of origin for other people. So I think that the book provides very good insight in this regard, and even several tools that the UNICTAD and several other international organizations provides, like the Rules of Origin Facilitator and other platforms. I would like to first to say an insight and then maybe reflect on something the gentlemen have said. First, concerning the carbon aspect within the Rules of Origin, I think it's very eminent that we see in the Rules of Origin negotiation countries are very business focused, and the human side or the developmental aspect is very hard to bring in. Of course, there have been several provisions trying to bring in that during the course of history, like the special differential treatment for ISDs or the accumulation within countries to promote cooperation in some way. But personally, I am very concerned on the aspect of food security, especially with the continent of Africa have been witnessing during the last couple of months. And I know that rules of origin is not a magic stick. It would not solve everything, but it's rather a reflection that I really wish that at some time there comes a way that it could try to solve or navigate this problem. I would also want to reflect on the question said by the colleague from the WTO concerning the multiplicity, but as a negotiator within one of the countries of the WTO, we try to harmonize as much as possible during the modernization of free trade agreements. Of course, that is not always possible, but at least it's one way that we try to make it a little bit easier for economic operators. Thank you.
Okay, I think there was another gentleman that had another question, and then...
Right, thank you. Pierre touched upon this a bit earlier, but I would actually like to know what your thoughts are on what the impact is of rules of origin on global value chains. Do you think that perhaps a different rule of origin that is negotiated can somehow shape differently how global supply chains are structured? So perhaps this question is both to you and to Dario, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. Of the first questions about, of course, the multiplicity of FTA is a cost for firms. The costs are multiplying. And this also is a big challenge for small and medium-sized enterprises which have to face and complying with different sets of rules of origin. We know that many multinationals, they have softwares, but in order to, they are delegating, to their special manager, the origin compliance manager, that is taking care of this software, which is updated by companies which are providing, which are mounting up this software, which we are regularly updated. However, the software itself, costs about $200,000 if I'm not wrong, and then you need updating. So not all those medium-sized enterprises they can have this. So obviously there is a case, for trade policy makers to put an eye, to try to solve, the situation. What we argue, in the recent stream of studies, also with economists, is to try to get a convergence, because when you go into the product-specific areas, that is one of the complexity of rules of origin. You find out that in certain sector, it is the form, it is the way, and that unfortunately is going to be technical. It is the way in which the rules is written, is drafted, rather than the manufacturing process underneath, which is different. So, you speak the same language in terms of manufacturing, but you say in a different dialect, So, obviously there is there is a need for multilateral action or plurilateral action. There is a need, to establish a fora where this issue could be discussed. And in this fora, the business and firms, they are the best equipped also to provide their inputs, which sometimes, are there, sometimes they are not there. And also, what I found myself when I want to hear from the firms is that they are reluctant. As I said, they are ambivalent first. They don't want to provide time in explaining, what they are facing. Second, they at times, they are secretive. They are not open to share because they think there's a business secret, while it is not. So these are, these are the kind of challenges that we are facing. But of course, we think the direction is towards establishing a fora for discussing convergence and bring it out to the trade policy makers. That's, I think, and not only on product-specific rules of origin, but also on administering rules of origin, because that's another issue. We have different school of thought in administering rules of origin. One is certificate of origin stamped. Another one is a e-certificate of origin. Another one is self-declaration. Even there, is getting really complicated. And that is another challenge on the challenges already existing for firms, especially medium-sized enterprises. But then, there is a line of work that we are undertaking with colleagues and also with the European University Institute. On the issue of Africa Continental Free Trade Area, well, there of course, is a challenge that is continuing. And there, what I found myself is that sometimes those that are participating are representing the view of the industries, but they are representing the views of the bigger industries. Here again, they represent the trade policy interest on major industries in their own countries, but that is only one side of a coin, in the sense that you also to see the potential for new industries. If you start a negotiating stance from protecting your own industries or persevering a trade objective, which is to maintain the status quo, obviously you don't create free trade. You create a perpetuating of the problems that is affecting the African continent, in my own perspective. I don't know if you want to share.
No, but GVCs.
The impact on global value chains. Well, obviously, rules of origin and global value chains, they go hands in hands, in the sense that global value chains, as I said, they are interacting with rules of origin. The example that I provided of iPad phone is a classical example on how rules of origin is interacting with global value chains. The iPhone is assembled in China, made of components made elsewhere. Now, are the rules of origin reflective that? At times, yes, at times not, because we do not have a uniform set of rules of origin. So when the phone is imported in the United States, is calculating the whole value of the iPhone imported in the United States, not the 10% value added. And this is creating the huge, at least in the trade figures, is contributing to create the huge deficit that the United States has in trade with China, and that is also pushing the Trump administration before and the current administration towards a perception that the trade deficit with China, is larger than when it is, realistically speaking, if you deduct, from the cost of value of the imported inputs, what is reality is not imputed to China, but are imputed to the countries that are trading with China. So ideally, a deflating factor should be adopted, but as I said, there is no multilateral rules of origin, so therefore, you cannot really adapt this. But this is, I believe, is an example of interaction of global value chains and rules of origin.
Well, regrettably, I think we need to stop at that point, but I want to thank our author, Stefano, and as well as our discussants, Pierre and Darlan, for being here, as well as you. Thank you very much for joining us today. In fact, there is a discount on the book through this evening, so time counts. Check with the bookshop. The book is also available for consultation at the WTO library. Thank you very much for your participation and for your attendance. Have a good afternoon.
See you for a third edition.